Joining us, and thank you to our panel. In March of 2022, 175 countries agreed to start negotiating a legally binding treaty that would limit plastic use and pollution. The UN Treaty on Plastic Pollution, which could include a ban on some of the most polluting uses of plastic, would be the most significant multilateral environmental deal since the Paris Agreement. The goal is to reach a deal by 2024, end of 2024. And the next round of negotiations will be in May in Paris. So we have this panel today to discuss what needs to happen between now and then. Before I introduce the panel, I want to introduce the audience question and answer system, which is called Slido. And I think we're going to put up a slide. You can scan this QR code, and that will allow you to type in your question or vote for someone else's question if you want to do that when we get to the question and answer period in about 20 or so minutes, 25 minutes. Let me introduce our panel now. We have Ana Cecilia Gervasi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Peru, Kirsten Schuijt, the Director General of the World Wildlife Fund, Stephen von Rijswijk,
well done,
CEO and Chairman of ING Group, and Leanne Geale, the General Counsel of Nestlé. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. I want to start with you, Kirsten. I'd like to ask if you could outline for us what the most critical elements, in your view, are in this treaty, if it's to be a meaningful one.
Right, no, thank you. And we were just discussing how new some of this is for many of us. Let me start by saying what happens if we don't get the treaty. We basically have 2 years to get it right, and there is a nature side to it, but there's also a human health side to it. So by now, about 90% of the marine species are being impacted by plastic pollution, and human health, by the fact that it's going into the bloodstream, it's having a major impact on children, youth, future generations, and us as we speak today. So in the next 2 years, we have to make sure we get that plastic treaty. And really what's important about the plastic treaty, I think, are two things. Number one, that it's legally binding. I think we've seen how important it is that there are many voluntary actions that are taking place. Lots of organizations are doing things, but we also have learned that if it's not voluntary, so it's more legally binding, that we actually get the level of ambition that we need. And two, it needs to address issues across the life cycle of plastics. So we need to look at banning out or phasing out some of the most toxic and most problematic plastics. We need to make sure that we look at recycling. And we need to make sure that we look at waste management, so the end-of-pipe issues around plastic. We're all seeing a lot of plastic in the environment. There are parts of the world where the beaches are literally littered with plastic and going into our drinking water and our oceans. And so that's, in a nutshell, I think what we need to see back into that treaty, legally binding and across the life cycle of plastic.
And Ana Cecilia, can I ask you to speak to why it is that we've seen many developing countries, Peru, Rwanda, play such a leading role in pushing forward toward this treaty?
Of course, thank you very much. Peru is highly affected by plastic pollution, both as a maritime and as a developing country. Therefore, as you know, we have been one of the promoters of this process together with Rwanda. We submitted a draft resolution at the last resumed session of the United Nations Environmental Assembly, which ended on the resolution providing us a mandate to finally negotiate a global treaty. As a sign of our firm commitment with this process, Peru has assumed the responsibility of chairing the Intergovernmental Negotiations Committee that will elaborate the International Instrument on Plastic Pollution. And in our view, this legally binding instrument should be ambitious and comprehensive.
Okay, I would like to come back to ambitious and comprehensive and what that means and why also it needs to be global as opposed to a patchwork of voluntary, but let's park that for a minute. Leanne, I'd like to ask you a little bit about, from the perspective of business, and particularly a consumer products company, what do you not want to see in this treaty? What would some of the hurdles be for business in such a treaty?
Yeah, just building upon what was previously said, a patchwork of voluntary provisions that didn't set a global baseline would be very problematic, because that's what we have now. And not having a harmonized global baseline prohibits economies of scale in terms of manufacturing solutions that are good for people and good for the planet, and doesn't help move each country, wherever it may be on the waste maturity hierarchy, as we like to say, from moving up that hierarchy. You know, from informal collection systems with no recycling, it all ends up in landfill, moving up the hierarchy to sophisticated systems where collection, recycling, extended producer responsibility is present. So the minimum binding commitments, leveling the playing field, creating a standardized approach that enable us to leverage at scale from an implementation perspective is what we hope to see.
What do you hear, Stephen, from investors? Is plastic pollution going to become sort of the next fossil fuels, or is it well on the way to being that? Do you hear potentially pressure from investors not to lend, for example, to the plastics industry or to companies that aren't taking steps such as these?
Not so much from investors as yet. We have, since a number of years, you see increasingly investors having a compliance department or a department that focuses on sustainability. That is largely has to do with the carbon footprint, so CO2 emissions. In the beginning, I think I started in the board around 6 years ago. That was at the end of an investor meeting. Then we said, well, we also have a compliance question. Do you have a carbon footprint policy? But now increasingly, these topics are the start of a conversation rather than at the end of a conversation. So it really becomes at the center for actually investors to be able to actually invest in your company, whether you have a good sustainability policy. Now, when it comes to plastic, I think that's also for the financial industry relatively new. And we do already, of course, get questions from NGOs. What do you do with that? If you look at plastic pollution, there is a systems change that needs to come about, and the finance industry can help with financing that to combat plastic pollution and therefore also contribute to the plastic treaty. If you now look at the level of collection and recycling that's currently being done of plastic, that's less than 20% of the global amount of plastic, so that's still quite small, and there's an enormous need but also demand for it. And if you then look at the entire process, there's an enormous investment that needs to be made in terms of the standardization or the design, the production, the collection, the sorting, and then the recycling of plastic. And the financial industry can actually help in financing each of those steps in the value chain. Now, that's not the only thing that we can and should do. In the end, we should also contribute collectively as one in terms of providing input to the plastic treaty negotiations. And that's why I'm proud, but I'm also very committed to be part of the finance leadership group that was convened by the UNEP-FI and supported by the Mindori Foundation, sponsored by the Mindori Foundation, to actually get input to make sure that we put also the financial industry in the right direction. So we give input with suggestions to the intergovernmental negotiation committee that you were talking about, to then develop standards for the financial industry to go by what should we do, what should we not do, and what should we only do in certain and finance in certain circumstances. And we in that regard get also input. We get input from the World Economic Forum. We get input from other experts such as the PRI. We work together with a business coalition that is led by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the World Wildlife Fund to actually make sure that we get the standards in there that the global industry can abide by, and by that way we make the most impact. And in that sense, I also would like to make a plea to the people here in the room or whomever is watching, at least in the financial industry. It's not too late. You can still apply as well. So I urge everybody to join that group as well.
I want to go back into sort of what needs to change in the way that industry uses plastics, consumers use plastics, what needs to be financed in terms of that change. But I want to just get a little bit more specific about what you all want to see in this treaty. I mean, what are the important elements. For example, ban on single-use plastics is one thing that seems to have quite a bit of agreement among many countries. Can we just enumerate some of the main elements that you think need to be in the treaty?
So if I can start, I think the ban on single-use plastics is an important one, and the phasing out of other toxic plastics, I think, is important. Again, the second one is really important to also have commitments on recycling. Not all plastic is bad. I mean, we're all using plastic, and so it's not about banning plastic. It's about banning the bad plastic, but also finding a way to recycle the good plastic that we're all using. And then third, going down the life cycle, is making sure that when plastic is wasted, because I think we have to be realistic. We live in a world, unfortunately, where a lot of waste does end up in our environment and on the streets, that we find ways to collect that, and there are different ways of doing that. So again, looking for concrete targets is what I'm hoping for, legally binding, and then lastly, I would also hope that we get enough financing on the table to finance all of this, right? A lot of the global agreements, I mean, we just finished a great global agreement in Montreal in December on biodiversity. Wonderful, but all the targets and all the finances are missing, and so that's what I would be looking for as well. It's not just a global agreement and a goal, specific targets, monitoring progress, and getting money on the table too, because it's a massive transition for our global economy, and it involves every single person. It involves not just businesses, governments, but us as consumers, right? It will require something from us as well in making different decisions.
What does it involve for companies? Let's talk for a second about what's involved, what's the cost for companies in replacing, for example, let's say single-use plastics. Can you speak a little bit to that, Leanne? What does that mean for Nestlé? How do you go about doing that, and is it possible?
Yeah, no, it is a big challenge because, of course, as a food and beverage company, plastics also serve the role of safety and quality, especially in transportation over long distances. So we have actually set up an Institute for Packaging Sciences where we focus research and development on different packaging solutions. Paperization is one of them, monomaterials is another, but also reuse and refill, because those two elements also have a big role to play. For example, in the plastics, the good plastics that we want to keep in the circular economy because they serve a very good role. But how do we make sure that reuse happens? And so a lot of work on the Institute. We also work a lot with partners, Consumer Goods Forum, along with a number of other FMCG companies. We came up with the golden design rules for packaging, for example, where we try to ensure that we maximize the value of packaging in the recycling marketplace after it's been used for food. So used for food safety, then what else can it be used for? So transparent PET is one good example of something that can be reused for different purposes. We also worked with PR3 on 10 standards for recycled content. Sorry, not for recycled content, for reuse systems, going back to the reuse aspect. So what do containers need to, how do they need to be made? How do they need to be collected? How do they need to be washed and sanitized? How do you label them? So much more than just the container itself, but the holistic system around reuse, refill, recycle, and ultimately for those that we want to phase out, an opportunity to focus on those and get them out of the system.
And Stephen, where is the opportunity? I mean, one of the things that's been very interesting in the kind of decarbonization of the economy is to see the business opportunity there and investment going in. Where is the opportunity here? Is it in this change away from the actual products themselves? Is it where? Can you talk a little bit about where in the transformation away from plastics is there an opportunity perhaps for new businesses or for businesses to invest?
Yeah, well, I mean, Kirsten already said it. There's a lot of financing needed. But you can imagine that there are waste companies and petrochemical companies and FMCG companies working together, where the waste companies are producing a lot of recycled plastic, whereby the petrochemical companies can therefore use it as feedstock, and that then the FMCG companies can then use as better input for the plastic products that they use for their products that they sell. And in that example, you can, for example, see that if you want to make an investment to make, for example, a recycling plant, that companies find it difficult to do that alone. So increasingly you see companies forming coalitions to do that together. And therefore you can set up an SPV, this is structured finance setting, a special purpose vehicle, whereby that plant is being developed by, for example, a waste company and an FMCG company, that you then look at the offtake that you get from it. Maybe there's other FMCG companies that want to have offtake, or the petrochemical companies want to have offtake in terms of feedstock. And that's then something that you can finance. And we did that, for example, we were involved in a joint venture exactly with what I just described. And we then recycle that plastic into oil. And that oil is then being used as feedstock again to replenish that in terms of renewed plastic rather than into new plastic.
Okay, I want to come back to that a little bit, but I'd like Anna, Cecilia, to ask you if you can help us to better understand. I mean, not every country has lined up behind this. There's been an agreement to start these negotiations, but can you tell us a little bit about the fault lines? Which countries are very supportive of the kinds of principles that you're talking about in this treaty, and which countries are going to have to be brought along to understand and be supportive?
Well, developing countries, of course,
yeah.
we suffer from plastic pollution. Peru is one of the countries that is most highly affected, as I said in the beginning. That's why we believe that the agreement should have a very comprehensive approach, including prevention and reduction of plastic pollution in the environment. And we think that it should promote a circular economy and address the full cycle of the full life cycle of plastics. When I say comprehensive from a perspective of a developing country as well, we believe that human rights and gender approaches should also be included in the agreement, because plastic pollution has a very considerable impact on a wide range of human rights issues, like the right to life, to health, to adequate housing, education, healthy environment. And for example, in terms of gender issues, waste pickers in developing countries are mainly women. So there is a whole social dimension there that should be addressed. I don't want to talk about particular countries,
Okay,
adhering to this negotiation. The negotiation process is one that is a process, as I said, that will evolve. But of course, developing countries like Peru are the most interested in having this process going ahead.
Kirsten, which countries have been more resistant to coming along?
Yeah, I do want to highlight how great it is that we have global Southern leadership on this. It is hugely important. And I think what's nice is that there is a broad coalition. So we see lots of countries, including even China and the United States, which I think is great as well. I think what you will see is that there are countries, of course, with a high vested interest in the oil industry and the petrochemical industry. Those are the ones that we're probably focusing on more in bringing them along, as in some of the other negotiations. So if you ask what are the countries that we should be focusing on and bringing them along more, I would focus on the countries that have a high interest in oil.
And if the U.S. is reluctant to sign on to a global treaty that is legally binding, are there ways that, can this treaty be effective without the United States?
Absolutely. Yes. Well, not without the United States, but without, if the United States doesn't sign on to most legally binding conventions that we have anyway, and yet we see some great progress in the United States, right? I mean, particularly at state level. So I would say, even though let's have as many countries sign on, and even the countries that don't sign on, you see a lot of progress being made. And I'm convinced that also in the United States, even if they don't sign on, that we'll see huge progress on this particular hugely important topic that affects everyone.
And is that because there is consumer pressure here? What role, we've talked a little bit about investors, we've touched on consumers. What is the role of consumers? I mean, can this work even if you do have all of these countries signing on at a government level? how do you get people to be willing to bring reusable bags to the grocery store or give up plastic water bottles? I mean, how important is that consumer role? Do you want to answer that?
I would say it's extremely important because it goes to convenience and behaviors of the consumer. And so we need to find systems, whether it be reuse and refill or recycling systems, that can bring that value add to them in terms of quality and safety, and yet also be convenient and allow them to shift their behaviors to something that's more sustainable. And so a lot of the research and work we've been doing, many projects around the world to try and crack that particular nut in terms of how do we make it as easy as possible for the consumer to buy into the recycling systems.
Can I just add
Please,
one more
please.
thing? Because the reason why we're actually moving also to a global treaty on plastics is because of consumers. So one of the big things that the WWF and other organizations did many years ago when we started this process is we actually got a petition from a lot of people from around the world that signed the petition to get to a plastic treaty. So that's already where it started. I think it comes from within us because we're seeing it in our environment. And we're slowly getting to grips with the fact that it's actually going to impact our health moving forward. So I think the consumers more and more will be demanding these issues from governments and from corporates to show leadership that, enough is enough.
Yeah.
Is that, please?
Well, I want to add to something that you said previously, because that, and you also used again the word regulation or treaty. And I think that's very important, and we've also seen it with carbon. In the end, I mean, if you want to inflict a cultural change, that may take a couple of generations, and we don't have that time.
Yeah.
And that's why it's good to have that regulation, that we have clarity what the direction should be. So, and there are still quite a number of uncertainties in that whole value chain, and that's where the treaty can help to clarify that. Let me give an example. If you look at, let's start with, let's say, the availability of feedstock. How much feedstock do we have? How much recycled plastic is being off-taken? So what's actually the demand level? What are normal pricing levels? What is the quality that recycled plastic that needs to have? And then if you then go to peel the onion on a number of these uncertainties, and I think you also talked about that, is okay, if we then, as a finance industry, talk to companies, what are the level of recycled plastic that they should have in their products to actually drive the fact that we go more to recycling than to first-time use of plastics. It would be helpful if we can align or actually make identical regional regulations on the collection or the sorting or the recycling of waste, so that these regulations are identical. When we talk about the recycling process, it would be good to understand, okay, what is a good process and what is a bad process. We can focus on what should we finance, what should we not finance, or only finance in situations. And let me give you an example. There is a chemical treaty, a chemical recycling process, and the advantage of a chemical recycling process is that you get a lot of different types of plastic, as opposed to mechanical recycling. But at the same time, and there are some guidance on that, but there's no guidance yet on terms of should you actually be financing the process of chemical recycling, because that's a very, very energy-intensive process. So more clarity in that treaty, but clear direction and regulation is helpful for all industries, but also in the finance industry, because then we can clearly direct ourselves where we can finance the transition.
I think, Leanne, that's a little bit what you were saying earlier about the need for this clarity and standardization. It creates a level playing field for companies seeking to make change. Is that?
Indeed, and if we can harmonize regulations across different countries, then it's much easier to bring scale to the solutions. Again, what we see right now is voluntary patchwork. Some governments do a great job, others they're lower on the waste maturity hierarchy, and it's very difficult for us, for example, working in 186 countries, to try and then leverage scale when it's all a patchwork. Right. So a minimum requirements of the treaty in terms of regulation and financial incentives are two things we'd like to see.
And maybe also just to add, I think what makes plastic, but also climate, so different than other things is that it is a global issue, right? I mean, the plastics that we throw in the ocean in Europe ends up in other places in the world, and unfortunately often in places, where people don't have the kind of resources to deal with it. So I think that's the global nature of the issue, I think, is one thing. And the other issue is the fact that, again, here we're dealing with externalities. So the price that corporations put on plastic does not reflect the social costs, the external costs on society, again, whether it's biodiversity and nature or whether it's human health. And then again, back to the need for a level playing field, I think the only way we can internalize those externalities is if we take a global approach. There's not going to be one corporation that is going to be wanting to internalize that when other corporations are not doing it and making an extra profit because of it. So again, I think it's the global nature and the externality issue that makes us really emphasize the legally binding and the global nature of this treaty.
I think that's the point you were making earlier, Ana Cecilia, about the reason that Peru and other developing countries have...
Exactly, and as a career diplomat that I am, I must say that every negotiation is a process, but diplomats always remain positive and optimistic and committed.
Okay, well, that's a good note on which to go to audience questions, which I believe we have on the Slido. Why don't we start with, let me just see, I'm seeing these also. Okay, why don't we talk a little bit about microplastics? NEVA recommended last week treating microplastics as a distinct category of plastic pollution in the treaty negotiations. Does the panel agree with this? Who wants to take that one? Is it a distinct category?
Well, I'll start by saying one of the things we'd like to see is an agreement on what are the negative micro and macroplastics that we want to see phased out. Again, to harmonize that and get those products out of the recycling system so the rest can work much more smoothly. They don't contaminate the rest of the process. So microplastics is something that we think needs to be addressed.
So you need a deal on, you need to define what the bad plastics are, in other words, versus the good plastics.
Yeah, and that comes back to, let's say, the quality of plastic.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some work to be done in order to gather data to define exactly what type of plastic are we talking about and are we using the same definition.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's a little bit the same with the carbon footprint. What are the, let's say, the glide paths that you would use for different types of plastic? And microplastics are for sure one of them.
And just to add, the reason why, and it also links to the other question on toxics, so I think microplastics is probably the one that we should be prioritizing, simply because, and now I'm not having my conservation hat on, but just from a human health perspective, it's the microplastics that get into the bloodstream. And the recent research is showing that it even, ends up most likely into the brain. It has impacts on fertility. It has impact on other health issues. And in terms of a top priority for me, from a human health perspective, the microplastics is probably the one we should be prioritizing. And of course, it also gets into the marine mammals in the oceans with all the devastating effects. And that's the one we need to get out.
How widely understood is that? I mean, I think people have their heads around, plastic bags and bottles a little bit, but do consumers really get microplastics and the dangers that are posed there?
I think we're just getting to terms. What I understand, and again, I'm not at all an expert on plastics either, but what I understand is that there's a lot of scientific research being done, at least with some of the European universities that we're working with as well. So there's a lot of ongoing research. But it's something that's happening every day as we speak. We're learning more and more. And I think consumers, you see a lot of countries banning plastic bags. So I think the awareness is increasing. Again, I will emphasize, I think the human health aspect is probably the one that's least understood. And that in the next 1 to 2 years is going to come to the forefront. And that's why we need to move fast, in addition to the devastating environmental impacts. Again, we're losing species because of this.
And I should say that it is also a human health issue because fish that we are eating now from the oceans are highly contaminated by microplastics. So that's endangering human health.
So there's a question here about container spills and shipping companies that I can't read because people's heads are there, but that's fine. Why don't we just sort of think of this, perhaps the question is really about sort of who bears responsibility through the supply chain for the plastics, microplastics, all plastics that end up on beaches and in the ocean. I mean, is that something that should be part of this? Is this one of the targets that needs to be set in the treaty?
I mean, I think it's important to look at the whole, everybody is responsible here. We were just talking about consumers, and I think the need for consumers to speak up and to demand and to change our behavior, to make different decisions. For corporations that play an important role in the supply chain, it's hugely important. And at the same time, I think we're also dealing with an issue with the fact that we just need to clean up the mess that we've made in the environment. So that is a top priority which we haven't really talked about yet, but the fact that we need to, most of the plastic pollution is entering the world through some of the biggest rivers in our cities. So just cleaning up the plastics in the rivers and in the oceans is usually, so it touches upon so many aspects of the supply chain.
So who bears that responsibility? I mean, I wouldn't think that might be beyond the scope of a treaty, or some of it might be if it's oceans. But who bears responsibility for cleaning up plastic throughout the supply chain in cities, in rivers, oceans? How does that, and who's going to finance that?
Well, then
We're looking at you for the financing answer. Who's going to pay for it?
I mean, extended producer responsibility is something that works well in sophisticated systems, that there's a fee leveraged, of course, at basic level, for the production and use of those packaging that ultimately can then be used to do cleanup. But again, that's in the most mature waste management markets. How you can replicate that and move that down to the rest of the countries is one of the challenges. But we believe EPR is one very positive route to go in terms of generating the funds to do the cleanups for those countries that are levying those fees and implementing and enforcing the fees in a consistent manner.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you talked about financing, so I'm the only bank at this stage, I guess, so people will be looking at me. But I'd like to broaden the point a little bit. In the end, it's getting to a definition how you can either avoid or detect and respond. And of course here this is about responding, and this is actually about stop the bleeding and therefore cleaning up the plant in the first place. Because that's the only way that you really stop the bleeding from the outset. But in the end, what you're doing is you ask a number of questions that need to be defined by this treaty in terms of, okay, who should take role in society. In the end, it will be the entire value chain, but who will do exactly what? And it's almost like with the scope 1, 2, and 3 in the carbon footprint and the energy pathways, which footprint should a certain part of society address, and how quickly should that be addressed? And only when you get to those definitions, then you get to a question of, okay, who's then going to pay for it, who can then finance it? But there will be circumstances, I'm sure, and we've seen it also with, let's say, developing new technologies, which then also will be the case for new renewable technologies or renewable plastic, that in the value chain there will be companies that are unable to make that speed. So what we need to do is to see, okay, where do we put the burden and where do we put the subsidies to be able to, for the entire value chain to act?
And I think, there will have to be various sources. I mean, one way to look at this, I can't help but mention the polluter pays principle, right? Which is, I think, a key principle as well, that those that are responsible for the pollution should also be paying for some of it. So that's a source. Again, I think the consumers, we as consumers, because it includes all of us, should also be willing to pay a higher price. If it requires different kinds of packaging and different kinds of use. So again, there are various sources. I think the problem is so big, there's not going to be one source.
But there's my concern, Kirsten. Because my concern is, and you see that also with the use of energy sources. Everybody agrees that we should decrease our carbon footprint. But as long as it costs more, people find it difficult to change their behavior. And I think we should, don't get me wrong. But also I personally find it difficult to change my behavior. I mean, I drove part of the travel, but not all of it. And so, that's the reality. So, and it's, for example, and I try to make to transpose it to, let's say, the housing market with energy. If you ask people, okay, do you want to make your house from a G label into an A label? Everybody says yes. Do you want to pay for the solar panels on your roof? the question is, well, okay, what's the payback time of the solar panel? So we really need to think how we can transition the society, and especially the developing countries, but also, let's say, the not so fortunate people in one society. How can we help them to transition as well? Otherwise, it will be the richer who will benefit from it and can and are able to do it, but the poor will not be. And that's something that we need to think about really smartly.
There's a good question here about the role of incentives for innovation and alternatives being integrated into the treaty. How could that work? I mean, we already have enough to cover here. It seems like a lot to do by 2024, but how could you work in incentives in this treaty? Does anyone have a thought on that? Okay, we might have to.
Well, I mean, I can go on forever. No, I try to build the analogy again with the carbon footprint, because there you can see, you can, for example, use, like you do with CO2 emission rights, that if you are recycling to some extent, you get certain rights. You can basically say that that subsidies for certain new developments will be there for a certain amount of time, like we have done with wind and solar. Now the price per kilowatt hour is lower than that of fossil fuels in a number of markets, but in the past 10 to 20 years it was not. So it's these type of incentives that will help, and maybe there's maybe one more. What you will also see in transitioning this part regarding plastic is that the most difficult part is to invest in something that is not proven. And the question is, who's going to pay for that? Because companies will be saying, yeah, but okay, I have a business model and I have a certain amount of money that I spent in R&D, but there's still a big chance that it will go wrong. Is there a bridge to that? And there also we need, let's say, the equity funds, but also the governments who step in where the return profiles are uncertain, to really get that kick started. Otherwise, it will take a long time to really create an impact.
And I'm also wondering if we can make the link, thinking about incentives more broader, you know, if we can link the plastics treaty or the whole transition away from a plastics economy also to a transition that we're experiencing hopefully sooner rather than later for fossil fuels, right? I mean, the two are so much linked. And so I think some of the incentives perhaps coming out of the you know, the decline in fossil fuels is maybe something as well. And the stimulation that globally we're doing is perhaps also similar incentives that could help move us away from plastics.
Well, I guess as carbon markets mature, I wonder what the impact of a more global price on carbon would be on, for example, the plastics economy, if that's part of it. We have a question here about needing to turn off the tap no matter the cost here. I think that's a statement. We need to turn off the tap. How do you see production and design being incorporated into the treaty provisions? Leanne? You know,
I mentioned that, but maybe you want to...
Yeah, I mean, design for recycling is a critical enabler there. For example, at Nestlé, we're already past 80% design for recycling in all our packaging products, and we expect to be more than 95% by 2025. So it's doable, and what we need is, again, harmonization and incentives and regulation to spur that design innovation to get to that place. So it is a very critical enabler.
We have a question here, Ana Cecilia, about developing countries attracting investment required to move up the waste management hierarchy. You mentioned earlier the role of waste pickers and the onus that falls on developing countries. How can the treaty help here?
Well, for instance, in Peru, we welcome foreign investment that is responsible with environment. And as promoters of this agreement, of course, we will make sure that those investments comply with the regulations that we need to promote in terms of this new legally binding agreement.
And does the treaty play a role in attracting that investment?
We hope that it will. Yes, we hope that it will be an incentive.
This is a really good question. What are key learnings as you think about 2024 and 2023, the next round of negotiations this year at hand? What can be learned from other international agreements? What are the best practices? Somebody mentioned targets. Kirsten, I think you mentioned the need for targets and monitoring. What are best practices to replicate, and what should be avoided?
I mean, to me, one of the best examples of a global agreement that was binding and that led to massive change is ozone, right? I mean, the fact that we've globally managed to agree to that, ban it out, and there was a lot of finance behind it. There was a lot of innovation and movement away from that. So I think that is a great example. I think that we're all still trying to learn from for the other global treaties. Perhaps that was an easier one than some of the other big topics that we're dealing with when it comes to climate and plastic. But I think the big learnings for us really is again, it is so important to have a global agreement, but unless you populate that with targets, with monitoring and reporting on your progression towards meeting those targets, and with enough money to help shift that transition. Because if you look at it, it's a massive transition. We're just talking about plastics, but include the climate transition and include the biodiversity crisis in which we're in, right? Those are massive transitions towards really a different kind of economy. I think that we're looking at a different type of relationship that we have with our planet. And so it's not enough to just have a goal. It's crucially important to populate that and to underpin that with real substantial action. And that would be my biggest learning, is how can we make sure we're talking about the urgency here. You know, again, we have 2 years to get it right. And if in those 2 years, plastic pollution is going to increase by 15%, that's what we're talking about. 90% of the world's mammals in the sea are facing with plastic issues. So, and again, we're just beginning to understand the human health issue. Just wait in the next 1 to 2 years what science is going to find out, what it's doing to babies, to children. These are our kids, right? So again, it's that to me is the biggest learning. Is not just an agreement. It has to be legally binding, and we have to underpin it with real action.
And if I could just build on that with one other element that we haven't really talked about, is transparency. Along with the monitoring, we need transparency to be able to hold everyone to account for the implementation of the treaty. So I think that's an important element as well. I mean, we really need the governments for the framework, regulatory framework, and the incentives. We need the corporates for the implementation power, and we need academia and civil society for the vision and knowledge to make this all happen.
One last comment, and then we're going to take a quick audience poll.
Yeah, I have 2 comments on that. So I think that, I mean, with ozone, that was a bit more binary. So you said already it was perhaps a bit easier, on hindsight perhaps. And this is probably, we need to develop our knowledge. And it's probably a bit more like carbon, personal view. And therefore, what I really like is the International Energy Agency's carbon directions per sector, because that there is at least a direction that we then all take. But what it also is that these sector pathways will change. So we will not reach perfection overnight. We probably need to amend every time to when we know more what to do. That's maybe the first comment I want to make. And the second is indeed on the reporting, and that's on data. I see it already coming, but there will be, of course, a massive amount of data being asked by everybody. And my real plea is to governments and supervisors, make the data definition consistent and simple. Because,
Right. Sorry, we're gonna go to the poll very quickly because we're running out of time here. Okay, in one word, you can all scan your QR code and go to have a look at this question, and I think you can choose an answer or enter your one word. In one word, what is the outcome you would like to see from the treaty? Sorry. We're going to do a word cloud.
It's a great summary of our panel discussion,
Although
I think.
I will say, as an editor, there are a few there that are more than one word. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you to our panel. Kirsten, I think you have a few closing words. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to say thank you, Elena, for guiding us through this incredibly inspiring conversation this afternoon. And thanks also to each of the panelists for your insights. I mean, really great here to see both the private sector, public sector, and civil society all here around a clear journalist in really bringing this conversation to life, because the plastic treaty is meant to be decided in 24 months, actually a little bit less than that if you think about where we are in January. And actually we see the words on the screen here. It really needs to be ambitious. We heard also today around not just ambitious, but we need to be accountable. Very good point at the end here too. But also there are some very key elements around innovation, and some of the aspects where we can actually see the innovation both upstream through new business models, what you're already looking into, reuse, refill, as well as downstream. So how do we actually increase the collection, sorting, and recycling, whilst also looking out for the informal sector? So hopefully this treaty can also bring in the elements around inclusivity. We know financing is going to be a massive need, but it can't all be on independent banks, right? So, and it also can't also be on the World Bank. So how do we bring in the blended finance approach? We know, for example, in Indonesia, it's going to take $18 billion just to begin the approach, and then a $1 billion year-on-year operational expense. So that's a lot of money to try to address this issue, and that's one country. So we know it's a massive issue, but we're looking at policies, a standardization or harmonization through this treaty. And again, when I think about the way that we're approaching the World Economic Forum's annual meeting here in 2023, it's around collaboration and cooperation in a fragmented world. And I really appreciate the conversation that we had here, which showed a lot of collaboration and cooperation across many, many voices, sectors, and different bodies of work. So thank you for your insights. Thank you to the audience here in person as well, live stream joining us today. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.